All right. So, hello and welcome back to Let Me Tell You Why That's Bullshit, where we try and sift through the absolute garbage fire that is contemporary politics. Because if it sounds too good to be true, it's probably bullshit. Just a quick note for everyone before we get ahead. Things are moving fast and there may be some changes since we recorded, and we're recording the evening of February 11th, 2025.
We have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
All right. So, Nick, how are you doing today?
I'm great, despite my 3 hours in the veterinary office. How are you doing?
About as good as I can be, all things considered. So, yeah, it's a lot to read the news, right? And like actually earlier today, you texted me and said, "Oh, Trump's absolutely crazy with this whole 50% tariff nonsense now." But we can talk more about that later.
I meant to ask you in our pre-thing, so I guess they're going to get a bonus. Did you see Elon Musk was answering questions today in the Oval Office, standing next to Trump while he sat at his desk, and the reporters were completely ignoring Trump and only asking Elon questions, and he had on his stupid mega black hat and like that sport coat that's too big. And the best freaking part about it was that Elon's kid, the like youngest one, was with him, and Trump got stuck babysitting. I was like watching this live, and this kid at one point was just like poking at Trump, and I was like, "This is the best thing ever." And he just looked so angry. It made me so happy. So like that was fun.
Oh no, I did not see that, but now I really wish I did. So
I'll send you the Midas touch clip on it because it's pretty hilarious.
Send me the clips. I could use a laugh.
It was pretty great because Trump did not look impressed with this child.
I mean, Trump never looks impressed when he's not the center of attention, right? Like I remember it was during his first administration, a G7 summit where he went into the middle of the group, pushed everyone to the side, straightened his jacket and like his hair, like treating like a fucking parrot. And I was like, man, this dude just like zero fucking class about it. But yeah.
I mean, he did manage to make the Super Bowl about him and the Gulf of America Day.
I saw that too, which was also just fucking stupid and insane.
We need a new maps program too, because Google changed the name of Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America, and now I'm out on Google.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know who else to use. I tried to use Apple Maps and it sent me not to where I needed to be. So
yeah. I mean, that's the one they always talk about on the Calgary traffic radio. Waze, that was it. They're always talking about using Waze. So I was like, all right, well.
I don't know. Apple do better. Google, stop it.
Yeah, right. All right.
I guess we should get into the Arctic.
Yeah, on the topic of stupid decisions made by stupid people, we're going to talk about the Arctic today. And for those who are unfamiliar, we are in Canada, which is the true north, strong and free. Although I was reading an article the other day that very accurately described it as the true north, more like neglected. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty accurate. And everyone seems to be really interested in the Arctic these days, and there's a variety of reasons for that. And the first of which is our first topic, is the strategic importance of the Arctic. So with climate change happening, melting ice opens up new shipping routes and access to resources that are all just have been basically hidden away under the ice sheet for the past, several millennia.
Vast amounts of resources.
Yeah, and there's a lot of it. And Canada makes up about 40%, or the Arctic makes up 40% mass, which is a very significant part of the country. And so it's vital for our sovereignty, our economy, and our Indigenous communities. Now,
well, and like, sorry to cut you off, but ironically too, in terms of sovereignty, like, it's funny because the Arctic is a big reason why Trump is like, no, I'm going to put 50% tariffs on you and make you become part of the US. Yeah. This has nothing to do with fentanyl. It's all about this.
Yeah. And like, it really is. Because like, so basically a lot of this boils down to a few different things. First is trade routes and like economics, because melting ice makes, shipping a lot easier. And part of that is Northwest Passage, which I learned about in 6th grade and is now suddenly becoming a lot more relevant in my life, because I remember learning about it the first time and be like, why can't we just get through like the Northwest Passage? It doesn't seem that hard. And then now being like 30 years old, I'm like, oh, makes sense. Ice is a thing. So
Rio, you weren't a very bright kid, were you?
no, I was not.
Not
Which
the
is why,
yellow crayon in the box, more like a navy blue.
yeah, like I was I wasn't the sharpest pencil in the case either. But which is ironic because now I'm like trying to get ready for a master's degree. So like at some point something switched.
I'm right there with you. I basically failed out of high school.
Yeah.
Now I have a master's and do this.
Yeah.
Life is weird.
Yeah. But anyway, so shipping is a really big thing. And a lot of the reason why the Northwest Passage is also such a big thing is because it's a lot safer, right? Like you're avoiding, the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz, which are, very unstable regions. There's piracy, there can be blockades, and it's also a shorter trip. So instead of taking 25 days going through the Panama Canal, it can take 16 days from Shanghai to New York via the Northwest Passage.
It's also the shortest route from the EU, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So instead of basically going through like all of the Atlantic, like across the whole Atlantic, you can basically go north, which is shorter, and then there you go. Yeah, north and around instead of having to go south and around, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we have a lot to kind of deal with when you think about just that by itself, right? And Canada claims the Northwest Passage as part of its internal waters. So Canada wants full control over travel, regulations, and environmental protections within the region. And this is something that's challenged by both the EU and the US. And that's not, that's ignoring the other actors in the region, including Russia, right?
Russia and now China.
Yeah.
Denmark.
Yeah, China, Denmark, like almost every Arctic country is trying to claim more and more of the Arctic as it becomes like more strategically relevant. And again, kind of tying this back to our resources, like the resources that are available to it, it really says a lot about like, yeah, you know what, this is why you want to go there, because that's where you get rare earth metals like oil and gas. I can't remember the other thing in our notes, and I don't want to scroll through the whole sheet, but yeah, we have a lot of stuff like that.
So I think right now, so it has the rare earth minerals, which Trump is clearly interested in because he's trying to get the Ukraine to pay him in rare earth metals for like aid. And then it has something like 30 or 35% of all the natural gas, of like undiscovered natural gas, which is huge.
Yep.
And 13% of undiscovered oil, which is now opening up. So like, it's not small, and that's all untapped as of now, right? So you have the Chinese moving in with Russia, who has clearly made some kind of deal with Russia to get access to the Arctic, because according to Canadian intelligence, the Chinese are flying missions now with the Russians, which was not happening even 5 years ago.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm sure we'll get into that, but it's not a small small thing. Countries want it.
Yeah, it's a very significant thing. And on the topic of like Russia flying missions with China, like before, like yesterday while I was doing some prep for this podcast, I came across something from CBC Radio, and it was an interview with it was a political science professor who was explaining like, China flying these like ostensibly weather balloons that are totally just spy balloons, wherever they can just to gather data. And they were flying a whole bunch of them in the Arctic, right? Because like, A, you need to survey the area, and B, you need to like start figuring out like what is where. And that's in addition,
what new defenses are up too, right?
Exactly, yeah. So like you basically just had cameras on balloons just taking as many pictures as they could just to see everything that's there and like everything that's popping up. And like strategically, Canada's always been lagging behind, right? Like, and we'll talk more about that later, but we don't have very many bases on there. Basically, we have Alert and Resolute, and I'm pretty sure that's it. Like
for now, yeah. The other thing it is, and this was a big thing that came up in Parliament before it got shut down, or I should say paused, because not to confuse it with US shutdown, is that flying those drones and they kept flying their planes like closer and closer, like that's just a test of boundaries too, right?
Yeah.
Like how many people do they have up there? Do they have any military defense? And how close are they going to let us get to the shores before it becomes a problem?
Yeah. And they
Turned
also,
out really close.
yeah. And that's how they test also like reaction times, right? Because like if you're flying a jet like as close as you can, we have NORAD, but another problem is that NORAD's just like super out of date, right? Like all the equipment up there is just like from the 70s and 80s and hasn't been really touched since like, I'm pretty sure around like 1995, 1999 was the last time I really heard anything about NORAD. And I even saw in like, is in the Department of Defense's policy doc on the Arctic that part of their plan is to start modernizing the equipment there, right? And like, Canada's Air Force is puny, so we kind of depend on the US because when that balloon got shot down, there was also a US F-20 or F-22, which was hilarious that the first aerial kill of an F-22 was that, but also that was the first aerial kill of a US plane in almost 40, 50 years. Like there's a lot, right? Continuing on the topic of resources though, because apparently Donald Trump's like really dead set on getting rare earth minerals wherever he can. The US, Canada, Greenland are all other competitors in the area as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, and part of the reason why Donald Trump seems to be also focusing in on Greenland and taking over, is because of the reserves of rare earth minerals, including uranium and potential oil and gas deposits. And I'm not sure if you knew this, Nick, but like I learned a little bit more about Project 2025 recently as well.
I read that thing cover to cover. I don't recommend it.
Oh yeah, like absolutely
That's one way to
mental health destroying document.
And for the record, as a total side note, they are pulling their executive orders word for word out of that thing. So fun times.
And one of them was like expand
Arctic.
and build more nuclear weapons, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like you need uranium to do that, and having control over the like uranium and other minerals that are in Greenland.
There's lithium up there too, isn't there?
There is, yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And there's actually lithium in the Canadian Arctic too. That's not currently controlled by a Canadian company. Fun fact.
That's not surprising.
Yeah, sold to a Chinese company. Like
I was just thinking, I bet it's China.
Yep. Sold to a Chinese company under the Trudeau government, which is why I'm like,
thanks, Trudeau.
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciate
Shut up,
it.
Rio. We don't want Polyev to find that out.
I know.
Next thing you know, he'll be standing behind no more China sites.
Yeah. If Polyev listens to this podcast, you're welcome. I'd expect some royalties too.
My consult fee is $100,000 a minute.
Yep. All right. Continuing on though, part of the resource issues as well is because of the UN Conventions on the Law of the Sea, there's so many, you have a certain amount of time to make a claim before you're granted like control over the area that you say that you control, right?
That's the UN, right?
Yeah, UN Conventions on the Law of the Sea.
Which are only, I think it's important to note that they're only recommendations. Nobody actually has to follow it.
Yeah. Exactly. It's kind of like,
which is part of the problem.
Yeah, it's the UN suggestions, right? Like, and it's the same thing that we're kind of seeing now, is that they're all considered suggestions, more or less. And what you can do after you like ratify the conventions of the Law of the Sea is you have 30 years to make a claim to a certain area that you say is yours, that you have to prove is geologically part of your whatever plate that you're on, right? And I learned, because I also had to read the Wikipedia article on this, Canada, Greenland, Russia, we all have major claims there, but so do Sweden, Finland, Denmark, basically anyone in the Arctic, and everyone's making claims fighting over who gets what, right?
But like what's interesting about like today and this happening now versus like, in the 80s or 90s is just like the political climate's different, right? Yep. So you look at Trump and world leaders go, well, so if I'm Putin and I'm like pretending to be a good world citizen, which, you know, he's not very good at because he like poisons people and stuff.
Yep.
But he does try to like pretend that he's a good world citizen. If you're Putin looking at this dumpster fire, you're like, sweet, I don't have to pretend anymore. This is mine. Fuck off. Whereas like, and I think it's in the notes later, but Denmark and Canada have this like ongoing battle over an island that's now been settled, but for like decades, every like a Canadian would go there, plant the flag, leave a bottle of whiskey. The Danes would go there, plant their flag, and leave a bottle of schnapps. Like, and then they're like, their deal was split the island in half.
Yep.
That would not have like, well, and that was finally in 2022. But we're just in like such a different political climate that it makes the territorial disputes just so much more dangerous, especially where Russia is involved, because he also has the backing of the Chinese now. Which means he also has the backing of the North Koreans.
Which, you know, the trifecta of dudes you definitely don't want to get on the like bad side of, right? And I wanted to mention this one because we have it in our notes, and also because it turns out it's a lot more significant than, you know, we originally had in our notes. But the Lomonosov Ridge dispute, pardon my pronunciation, it's an underwater ridge claimed by Russia, Canada, and Denmark. And all of them say that it's part of their exclusive economic zones under the UN conventions of the law of the sea. Because if anyone can prove that's part of their continental shelf, they can claim rights to the resources on the seafloor, which includes oil and gas and minerals. And Russia has submitted several like really aggressive claims about it.
Yeah, they keep putting their flags on the ocean floor. Like they're sending people down. I was reading about this afternoon, and like planting their flags on the ocean floor.
I was actually right about to mention that, because the first one that I could like find in the region was in 2007, where they sent two DSVs to survey the seabed, and then they specifically put a rust-proof titanium Russian flag right on.
Know that it was titanium.
Yeah, like it was a titanium rust-proof Russian flag, and they planted it right on the North Pole, just like so that they can claim like, yeah, this is ours, right? Because they're trying to prove that geologically it's theirs, but also just trying to say like, no, it's ours. Like, you know, we're claiming this now, even if it's not like approved and not like in any sort of way.
Well, that's kind of the difference right now, right? Like, geographically and geologically, like those are like scientific things that you can, in theory, invest a bunch of money in science to go and prove. But then looking back like at the political landscape we have now, where apparently US presidents can be like, we're just going to make Gaza beachfront property. It's a completely different world, right? So why wouldn't Russia just be like, we're not doing that. It's just ours. Fight me.
Yeah, exactly. Especially considering the fact that Canada's Navy is like 24 ships, right? Like, and of those 24 ships, I also learned this recently, it's like we have 4 diesel submarines that we purchased secondhand from the UK, which are not capable of going into deep Arctic water. But again, more on that later because I have more notes on that. So
yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because Canada has said that they're going to invest $73 billion into the Arctic. But then when you look at the fine print, that's over the next 20 years. My worry is that we don't have 20 years.
No. And we really don't.
We might not have 20 days.
Like 20
I
years
don't want to
is
sound alarmist, but
20 years is really optimistic, especially considering like, you know, Russia invaded Ukraine. Donald Trump is openly saying that Canada can't depend on the US for defense. Like,
and not just Canada, the world, right? Like the EU is wondering if they're next. And like Gaza, he said he's gonna, and not just like from a we're gonna tariff you standpoint, from a we're going full imperialist at this point.
Which is really, it's very alarming stuff, right? And like it's really, we're kind of hitting a point again where it's like, you know, people are going to start invading just because they can, and that's going to be how borders are redrawn, right? There's no such thing as a diplomatic solution, it seems, these days.
Well, and I guess I do worry a little bit about because like Trump only cares about, so I guess he kind of cares about Alberta too, because that's where most of their oil comes from.
Yeah.
Their refineries aren't actually equipped to process the oil that they pull out.
Yeah.
That's why they get so much oil from Canada.
Yeah.
So part of me is like, well, this might not even matter, but it's kind of worrisome because Canada doesn't have much of anything up there.
Yeah.
And I worry about like Russia and the US coming in and basically just like carving up the Arctic amongst them. And what's Canada really going to do about it?
Yeah, we can't really stand up to either one, right? So if they just went up and started carving up like Northwest Territories, Yukon, and Nunavut, like nothing we can really do about it. Sorry, 3 seats of the Senate and 3 seats of the House of Commons, but Canada can't really defend itself in the Arctic. And that kind of is a really good segue into our next topic, which is the geopolitical rivalries and military buildup in the region. Because
I planned it that way, Rio.
Yep. So that's great because on the topic of things that Canada doesn't have, Russia controls nearly 50% of the Arctic coastline, and this includes approximately 20 military bases in the region. Like these are.
And how many do we have now? 3? 2?
Yeah, Canada has 2. We have Resolute and Alert.
And then Greenland has 1 plus the US one?
Yeah. So,
or is it just the US one?
I'm pretty sure it's 1 plus the US one. I'm pretty sure it's I didn't do like a lot of research into that part, but I'm pretty sure it's a Danish base. Yeah, so 5
Either way,
versus
it's
20.
not 20.
Yeah. Just a solid 4 times more than what the West has stationed. Russia has been thinking about this for a long time. And, in addition to these bases, they also have, increasing nuclear submarine patrols. They've deployed hypersonic missile systems. They operate the largest fleet of icebreakers in the region, which includes nuclear-powered icebreakers, which, again, allows them to control Arctic trade routes all year round. And they plan to continue to expand that influence with more icebreakers and Arctic warships. So that means that Russia is the largest northern fleet, or Russia's northern fleet is the largest naval force in the region, specifically designed for Arctic warfare, and they regularly conduct drills in the region. Now,
which have been actually like gearing up too.
Yeah.
And expanding into Canadian territory, which is what sort of alerted Canada to the problem, because they started seeing Chinese planes and they were like, what the F is that?
Yep. Which again, it kind of says a lot that like Canada's kind of just so lagged behind that it took that to wake them up, right? And like the US and NATO have responded kind of in the sense that they're planning to reopen Cold War era bases in Alaska and Norway to try and counter the expansion, and also running more exercises themselves.
Yeah.
So
well, and I think that it's interesting because this was like a super like, and I want to be clear about this. This was a bipartisan failure for both the Harper governments and the Trudeau governments. Like we knew that Russia was building up this stuff in probably somewhere between 2005, 2006. This was like key Harper era.
Yeah.
Like he came into power in what, 2007? 2006? Somewhere in there. So like, so like this is a bipartisan failure, and both the conservatives and the liberals have sucked hard on this issue despite the science for decades on global warming, despite the ice melting since the early 2000s.
And even
I just
like
noticed a lot of comments in like on our YouTube lately being like, oh, you're really one-sided. No.
It just happens to be we're criticizing the conservatives a lot, right?
We go where the facts are. And so I just wanted to be clear that like this is something that both Harper and Trudeau ignored. And I think it's like this next election, as I've talked about before, is going to be about trade wars and resources. And I think that both Polyev and presumably Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland or whoever wins that needs to come up with a solid plan and then follow through, or we're going to find ourselves without the Arctic fast.
Yeah. And I remember, I'm not sure who it was, and I'm not totally sure where I saw it on like CBC, but I saw someone talking about like expanding the Canadian Arctic Rangers and like recruiting 100,000 more. And I was like, well, our military right now is about 90,000 people. We're
So you're
like
going to double the military?
yeah, so you're going to double the military, really? Like it's hard enough getting 100,000 people to serve already, and 67,000 of those are reserve force, right? So like,
And you're going to do it in the Arctic?
yeah, and you want to do it in the Arctic. Like I remember at one point, like it was during my undergraduate, because I was like, maybe I should just join the RCMP. Like it's not the worst job I could possibly have, right? And then one of them, like I was talking to a guy because I was actually interviewing for CBSA Border Services, and then he was like, "Yeah, I also thought about RCMP, but my problem was like you don't choose where you get stationed, so you just get sent to fucking Baffin Island, and you're just stuck in Nunavut for the rest of your life." And I was like, "Absolutely not. I'm good."
Well, even when they thought of, and this might be in our notes later, I'm not sure, but even when Canada was thinking about defending the Arctic, instead of actually building stuff out, they used Indigenous people as what they called flagpoles.
Yep.
And it's about as terrible as you think it is from that statement. So it's not like they've had any seriousness in building up the Arctic at all. And I don't even know really, because this is the tricky part, right? Like we're going into an election and it's really hard to gauge, okay, what are you going to do versus what you're saying you're going to do?
Yeah.
So if this stuff with like Trump happens to lapse, and that relationship gets better, are you just going to be like, we repaired stuff with the US, they'll take care of it?
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that Canada failed to do, which is on the Trudeau government after Trump left in 2016, because nobody actually thought that people would vote in an actual insurrectionist again.
Yeah. And convicted criminal again.
And a convicted felon, right? So like, but here we are. And I think, unfortunately, for whoever is Trump's successor, which is the language Fox News used on Super Bowl Sunday, whoever comes in, Republican or Democrat, regardless of how they feel about MAGA policy, is going to have a hard time getting the world back, because the US can't be trusted. And it's like, I don't think that Americans quite understand how screwed and like destroyed their reputation has become in 3 weeks.
Yeah. Well, even like, so
it's bad.
Yeah. So even just the other day with Trump talking about like steel and aluminum tariffs, or no, that was yesterday or this morning, it was one of the two. And, imposing steel and aluminum tariffs, like
yesterday.
Yeah. So things get crazy expensive when you tariff your basic building blocks, right? Like, so how are you supposed to, build cars or planes or ships if all of a sudden you're paying like 25% more on steel and aluminum, which on March 1st is going to become 50% more every time it crosses the border, right? Like,
well, especially if you want to build up your Arctic defense or take the Arctic away from Russia or Canada, or Greenland, right? And here's the interesting thing about aluminum. I was watching Power and Politics on my way to the vet today, prepping for this, and they were actually talking about the US didn't actually ramp up their steel and aluminum production when because Trump imposed these tariffs in his first term as well. And that community didn't, like that industry didn't up its production really at all. And in fact, like just this week, they were like, what are you doing? Like, we don't have enough to sustain the US. Never mind if you have imperialism motivations in mind. So it'll be interesting to see. Like, don't get me wrong, it's definitely going to slow down, especially in March, if Trump's like, oh, you have 50% tariffs for 30 days. Suddenly, like, nobody's going to buy aluminum for sure for 30 days. That's going to like destroy the industry. It could destroy the like they're talking right now, the automobile industry could be destroyed within days, not weeks, like days. It's just going to shut down. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that just adds a whole other layer of complexity to this problem.
Yeah, and I actually heard the same thing on. It was about that from the National last night because they were saying, or Andrew Chang was saying that because
I
you're,
really like him. He's
oh,
probably my favorite, like,
he's my
political
favorite.
reporter.
He's my favorite CBC host. Like I see him 10 minutes a day in the morning when I watch the national recap. And it's my favorite 10 minutes of the morning. So
Yeah, I really like him.
yeah, but he mentioned the same thing, right? And what he was talking about was that because China produces so much more steel at like artificially low prices, you know,
Mm,
the US basically just continue to drop their production. And then they just continue to import from Canada and China where they can get it for cheaper. So all of a sudden now, if you're putting a huge tariff on, your steel and aluminum that you get mostly from other parts of the world, you're not going to be able to catch up in 30 days, right? Like it takes years to get that kind of infrastructure going and that kind of production going.
right.
So it's just really damaging to your own economy to have such huge tariffs on things that you need to import. So it's absolutely just like
Which
a
would
stupid
totally
decision.
matter if he actually cared about the American people, but he just wants money for his sovereign fund. So
Yeah, the sovereign wealth fund that most of them fail except for Norway's.
who has oil?
Yeah, who has oil and gas,
Lots
right?
of oil.
Yeah,
Oh, good God. Okay.
yeah. So anyway, all that is to say, like, there are a lot of geopolitical rivalries in the area, and now with like China and Russia moving in together, and oh, we should also probably talk about China a bit more, and I'm like not going to skip over that because that's a really important one. Having them move in together is really detrimental to the West's interests because it makes things a lot harder for us. And part of that is the economic military influence that China is also like, they're working on with Russia. And China economically wants to influence the region with part of their Polar Silk Road, which they're trying to integrate into their Belt and Road Initiative, where they kind of just control major shipping lanes all around the world, right? So part of this is that they want to build commercial shipping routes to rival Russian and Canadian trade routes. And part of how they're doing this is by conducting scientific research missions in the Arctic, which also happen to be military intelligence operations using things like those, spy balloons that we saw a little while ago, right? And China also appears to be increasing its naval presence, pardon me, in the area. And again, conducting exercises in the area, trying to gain that Arctic, operation experience. And again, that should be really concerning. Canada's
Well,
had
it's not
that.
like they're
sort
going
of
to go anywhere either, right?
Yeah.
I think again, it was Power and Politics that might have been talking about this. But just this idea that suddenly China it's kind of akin to this like Trump Musk friendship, right?
Yeah.
Musk gave Trump like $200 million or something crazy to like buy that election.
Yep.
Whereas China opened the doors to North Korea, who is now sending troops to Ukraine.
Yep.
So there's this idea that basically Russia is basically indebted to China. Yep. And I'm sure that those conversations with Xi have been like, yeah, we're doing this, we're keeping it open. You will allow us into the Arctic. And unlike Putin's opponents, he's not poisoning anyone in China. Yeah. Like, if there's one dictatorship that is worse to fuck with than Putin, yeah, it's China. And so this should be like seriously alarming, if for no other reason than suddenly China has basically unprecedented access, yeah, to Russian Arctic shores.
Yeah. And as an extension to that, they have access to all those resources, and they have greater access to Canada and North America, which is a great segue because, talking about the rapid militarization of the Arctic and all these people that are really interested in the area, Canada, being one of those parties, has had a lot of challenges trying to assert itself in the area. And we can now dive into that because despite Canada's like huge Arctic territory, it doesn't have much infrastructure. Its security in the region is like awful. And there's several environmental challenges that are also posed by any sort of expansion into the region, right? We're going from an isolated region to a geopolitical hotspot where everyone is suddenly interested.
Thank you, global warming.
Yeah, really excited for my summers to be suddenly full of like Chinese and Russian planes flying around.
Well, and I think what's interesting about the infrastructure gaps is, and I can't believe Trump is making me do this, and I might have to go brush my teeth after I vomit in my mouth. But there is one thing that Trump isn't wrong about, and it is that Canada does rely on the US for a lot.
Yep.
And so they have relied on the US to kind of help keep the Arctic safe, if not through anything except for like the intimidation of the US military behind them, right? With NATO alliances. So it's not like Trump is exactly wrong when he says like, well, Canada's relying on us for XYZ, although on the other hand, that's why we have NATO. Yeah, so I have a lot of mixed feelings about like the gaps versus the reality and like why they're there. And I guess it just feels a lot like, I was thinking about this the other day, and my husband was complaining about just like military presence and, you know, like the dismantling of government in the US and like all the DEI stuff that's happening down there. And like, it kind of really feels like we've stepped back into this like post World War II era.
Yep.
And so all I can think is like, I guess the 30s are back.
Yep.
Because like it really feels like every nation for themselves. Nobody can be trusted to do anything. Everybody has this like imperialist motivation behind them or resource motivation. And given the Arctic is now opening up, that means we're the most screwed.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And like I mentioned this earlier, but Canada's armed forces are only 100,000 members. And like I just pulled out the Wikipedia pages just so I can get like a quick overview of like how our capabilities are. And Canada is still flying like CF-18 Hornets in its Air Force. And like those things are ancient planes. Let me quickly pull up the Wikipedia page for that one now. But
I mean,
yeah.
I think the only good news is right now the EU doesn't seem like our other NATO allies don't seem to be interested in this Trump bullshit.
Yeah.
So like France, for example, had enough of it and sent planes to Greenland and then was like, Trump, we've sent military planes to Greenland, fuck off, or, you know, we're going to get other, like, I think Germany said that they would be the next one to send planes out.
Yep.
So at least like where we are now, I think that we would have the backing of NATO.
Yeah.
But I think, was it you and I that I was talking to you when we were talking about like, okay, but how long does it take the NATO allies from Europe to like get mobilized and get over here? Because Trump's going to make it much faster up to the Arctic. Russia's going to be the same. So
yeah, you and I were the ones talking about that last podcast because like we run exercises going to the Eastern Front towards Russia, but now we have to think about how are you going to go from Poland basically all the way to Canada now. You know, the logistics are completely backwards. So the lanes are probably the same. We have a challenge of like you're going in a direction you're not used to do something you're not used to operate in an area where most of your like militaries don't operate, right?
Well, I guess the threat is completely different too, right? Because like the threats, you know, the Bulwark was joking about this yesterday or the day before, wondering if they were now an Axis ally.
Yeah.
Because they were like, we're really confused about who our allies are at this point.
Are we the baddies?
Yeah, that was like exactly the question. And the problem is that like when we were running these drills and like making these prep plans, nowhere in those plans did anybody actually think that we would have to defend ourselves from the US, which is literally like under us.
Yeah.
So I don't know how fast. I mean, luckily Trump's not as smart as somebody like Hitler was, because I guess the difference, because people have been joking a lot lately about like, oh, well, Trump's Hitler, which isn't much of a joke because like if you look at Hitler's playbook, it's exactly the same, sans gas chambers. Instead, he's just sending American citizens to El Salvador and immigrants to Gitmo. Hitler would say one thing and be like, yeah, we're all friends.
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, he's building up his military and, waiting to invade Poland.
Yeah.
Trump just tells everyone what he's going to do.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. At least he's upfront about his intentions.
That. He really sucks at keeping a secret.
Yeah.
Like, he's not very good at imperialism.
Yeah. And this is a little bit of fun Canadian trivia. We used to actually have a plan specifically to defend against invasion by the United States back in the just after World War I, 1919 to 1939 was when we still had it. It was called War Plan. Nope. It was called War Plan Red, and it was abolished after the 1930s because all of a sudden we were all hunky-dory and friends again. But I just find it interesting that we literally thought about this before as a country. We have thought about this before where it's all right, we have a giant military that's kind of unstable to the south of us that has invaded us in the past in 1912. What are we going to do about it if they do it again?
And when did we burn the White House?
1814.
Okay, so it took from 1814 to 1912. So 100 years.
Yeah.
To... Was my math right there? Yeah, 100 years to build up enough trust, which takes it takes a lot more to build up trust than it does to destroy trust.
Yep.
So it took 100 years to build up trust and be I guess we don't need this anymore. And it's going to take Trump 9 days to completely destroy that.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Just wanted to be clear.
Yeah.
Maybe we should have that plan again.
Yeah, it's probably time to revisit War Plan Red. And as part of that, we can talk about the infrastructure gaps that we need to fix, like our crappy icebreaker fleets, our lack of surveillance and military presence, and overall Canada just kind of doesn't have much infrastructure that's useful up there. And you were talking about using Indigenous people as flagpoles before. And I wanted to mention during that little bit that I remember learning about that in high school as well, where as part of Canada trying to assert its sovereignty, they're oh yeah, we moved all these people there, we provided them with houses and da-da-da-da. And I was well, you did that with Indigenous.
Spears?
Yeah, you basically gave them spears and really crappy shacks. Yeah, without any sort of heating. And you just told them figure it out. I was and even back then I was kind of seems like a weird little scheme to try and say yeah, we're totally defending the Arctic, even though you just have harpoons.
Actually, and that's this is a whole other political layer to put on top of that.
Yeah.
But between Canada, the government of Canada and the Inuit populations up there, because we've sucked at reconciliation. It's terrible. And so now we have to build up the Arctic. It's really important. Canada hasn't done any reconciliation on the flagpole stuff. I mean, we haven't even gotten safe water to one of the reserves in Alberta that hasn't had clean water in 30 years.
Yeah.
How do they plan on geopolitically repairing that relationship?
Yeah.
To get access to do their plan? Because I think it's important that we also talk about how they've made a plan for 73 billion over 20 years, which is probably with inflation gonna have to pump up that number. 1.3 billion, I think, over the next 5 years it was for technology and bases and sort
it's
of
not enough.
No, and then you add in that layer of having to do reconciliation at the same time, and I think it's really going to matter who gets in at that point, because Poilievre's not going to do any of that. He's going to say, get the fuck out of my way.
Yeah.
We're doing this.
Yeah.
Which, politically speaking, if that's what he's going to run on, because, this could go any number of ways with him. Right now, he's focused on fentanyl, but tomorrow, maybe they change to an Arctic focus, which they've already kind of done because he started talking about it. They have an Arctic policy, but he's not going to work with Indigenous people. He's going to say, shut the fuck up. I need to do this. This is what's going to happen. And by the way, get rid of those houses right there because our military base is going there. Which like sounds dramatic and fear-mongering, but like we've done it before.
Yeah. And I think something that like
our city just like bulldozed a whole bunch of indigenous land for a ring road.
Yep. Yeah. And
like I shouldn't be laughing, but like that's how fucked up it is.
yeah, we tend to ignore indigenous people. And I actually just had this thought while you were talking about that. And then thinking about like Canadian Rangers kind of also made me think about this too, is that these are people who have lived in the region for thousands of years, right? They have knowledge that no one else has, that you could absolutely use and leverage, that is strategically important, right? Because like, you know, these are people who have lived there and survived there in like the harshest climate in the world for thousands of years.
They might know something about it.
Yeah, they might know a thing or two about how to defend yourself in the Arctic, right?
Given that we ignored the Arctic. And actually, it's interesting too that you bring that up, because this episode from December that I was listening to on CBC, I really like that show. I find that David's pretty good. Have you watched Power and Politics?
A couple times, yeah.
Yeah. So like David's generally pretty good. But he did, when Jolie there was talking about indigenous knowledge, he kind of pushed back and was like, why does that matter? And I was quite impressed, because she was like, whoa, hold up. Like, we have ignored the Arctic. They know, first off, they know what's melting and where.
Yep.
They know where the gaps are, where those like they know about, like, for example, like wildlife populations, which you wouldn't think is a big deal, but like if you're gonna send troops there, you might want to know where, I don't know, polar bears are. Because they're gonna eat you. They're not like grizzlies. They are not fun. So like even things that you wouldn't think about, like knowing like where your local wildlife is and how the global climate change is impacting like where they are they coming closer to bases? Like the last thing you want to be worrying about when you're trying to defend against Russians and Chinese is worrying about polar bears coming in your back end, which, by the way, as somebody who spent a lot of time in northern Manitoba, is scary as shit.
Yeah.
Like, people might be laughing at this point, but I can't there's just so many things that people don't think about, and Canada has ignored the Arctic for so long. It's almost like the people that have lived there, like, okay, it's so fucked up that this show, after they had like Jolie on, the next 15 minutes of that segment was 3 premiers, none of it Northwest Territories and Inuvik. When was the last time David got 3 premiers on his show to talk about anything? For our US listeners, that's basically like our governors. That's a pretty good comparison.
That's a pretty accurate example. Yeah.
And they, again, like he was saying, like, this is what Jolie said, like, it seems weird, no? And they were like, no, because we know about our own regions. So like I find that quite striking and kind of showing the ignorance of government, because these are the people that are supposed to protect us. And like Trudeau's not listening to them. Poilievre's definitely not going to listen to them. Mark Carney is basically a conservative in.
He's a red Tory. Like he's a pretty red Tory.
Like he's definitely not Trudeau. He's like economically conservative and socially liberal at best. So I don't know, like this, it's not a good situation.
It's a really hard thing to think about, and like the fact that we need that leadership there and we're just so blatantly ignoring them, and the fact that we've also so blatantly ignored just the issues of those communities for a long time. Like, so my girlfriend has a friend who actually lives in the Northwest Territories, and she was saying like, it's like $8 to $11, like
insane. I have friends up there too, and they'll like post stuff from the grocery store, and I'm just like, or even just going up to like northern Manitoba this summer, I think I paid $25 for grapes.
Like that kind of stuff is like, you can't really get food there. So imagine moving like lumber, steel, concrete, all those other things that you need to build bases and like infrastructure. Getting all of that into the north, like into the north and the Arctic, is going to be crazy expensive. Not to mention the cost of actually like, building it. And I'm pretty sure I have a cousin, and he's a combat engineer. He recently joined the forces, and I'm pretty sure he was recently deployed to the north. So I definitely saw just a fucking huge ass ice sheet on his Instagram at some point, and I was like, cool. So still nothing there, huh?
Yeah. And like, and if you don't think that indigenous leaders aren't going to be like, hey, you should probably consult with us. So if Polyev tries to go in there, he's going to be fighting the Russians, the Chinese, Trump, and indigenous people who are sitting there screaming, "You're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Listen to us."
Yeah.
And apparently polar bears.
Yeah.
Little polar bear armies. Now I'm going to be thinking about that all night.
I mean, you ever see that meme? This is probably like 15 years ago now, like bear cavalry, where it's like dudes just riding bears with machine guns. We should operationalize that idea. I think it'd be really smart. Like, first of all, Canada has a whole bunch of Kodiak grizzlies just running around. May as well put them to good use.
God. I think they turn on us, Rio.
We got to incentivize them. Anyway, on the topic of bear armies, that leads us to our next subject, which is Canada's Arctic defense response. Because of all the geopolitical competition and the fact that we're ignoring Indigenous people so much, Canada, as you've mentioned, has announced a $73 billion defense investment over the next 20 years. That was announced in April 2024, and with the goal of modernizing Arctic security, surveillance, and military infrastructure, with the goal of becoming our North strong and free, proper military force in the area, right? And we're supposed to try and counter that Russian and Chinese aggression in the region.
Did you see a timeline on any of this? I couldn't really find one this afternoon.
So what I've found, just kind of like digging through the policy doc, is they've kind of started with like more diplomatic solutions first. So part of this was actually opening up consulates in Alaska, and I think it was Norway and Denmark were the first like 3 that they opened up. The idea being like, well, we can now promote, our interest in the region. And part of me was like, I guess that makes sense. Another part of me is like,
but now we have Trump in Russia.
Yeah. So I was like, well, you kind of have a problem there because you're trying to be diplomatic to parties that don't want to be diplomatic, right?
Yeah.
Like you have an actively hostile president, and then to the south of us, an actively hostile country to the north of us. And then our only real allies at this point are the EU plus Australia-ish, like Anzac. And great.
The nice thing is that Trump's pissing off like the entire world. So
yeah, I saw a really funny Reddit comment that was like, if anyone invades Canada, because they're so internationally beloved, everyone's coming to the defense of Canada, right? Like,
I saw that too.
Yeah, and then another, it's like literally
you leave the Canadians alone.
Yeah, and in the same comment, they were like, Canada's never lost a war it's been involved in. And a lot of the Geneva Conventions are because of Canadian violations in war.
I'm convinced it's also because, like, people think that Canadians are so, like, non-combative and, like, polite. But, like, make no mistake about it. We burned the fucking White House.
Yeah. I saw it described really nicely. I was like, Canadians...
Not that I'm like promoting burning the White House, even though Trump's like orange pasty stuff probably burns really well.
Yeah. I can think of other orange things that burn really well. I saw it really described really nicely that like Canadians aren't nice. They're just polite, right? And like...
Well, it's like we're not less racist up here. People seem to think we're less racist. And like, obviously I'm white, so I don't have any real like experience with that.
Yeah.
But, and maybe you can comment on this, but a lot of my friends who are people of color are like, part of me likes the US because at least I know who to stay the fuck away from.
Yeah.
Because people in the US are like, I don't like you because you're Philippine or you're black, like fuck off. Whereas Canadians will be like super nice to you and then not give you clean water for 30 years.
Yeah. And I've had the same experience because like, and this is as someone who's experienced racism, right? Like I've been spit on, it's fucking awful. So I've said that overt part, but then there's also that like really subtle part too, where it's like, sometimes it's just like an offhand comment that you're like,
Canadians are very passive aggressive.
Yeah, and Canadians are incredibly passive aggressive, so you get a lot of that shit. And sometimes you're just like, I feel like that was a one-off, but then it's the same person doing it like several times, and you're like, oh no, that was not a one-off. That is a pattern of
You
behavior, my
probably live
friend.
in like the worst province in the country for it too.
Oh yeah, Alberta's the worst. Like being like having traveled across Canada and like been to BC and Ontario and like even the
Although I have
Maritimes
seen some like
actually.
incredibly disgusting racist things in Ontario towards Black people when I was there that made me stop and be like, the fuck is happening? And then like people from Toronto, because it happened in Toronto, because of course it did, they were just like, because I was like, what the fuck? Like I remember being in a cafe and like audibly saying, what the fuck, at like this racist thing that was happening in front of me. And even the person that was experiencing it like looked at me like, are you new here? And I was like, yes.
Yeah.
What is happening? What is wrong with you people? And this like other white person was like, oh, this happens all the time. And I was like,
That's not okay.
what the fuck?
Yeah.
Anyway, and then I bought that person coffee. The person that was experiencing problems, not the white racist. I feel like I have to like clarify.
I'm glad you clarified.
Solidarity, white people.
Yeah.
Oh my god. Yeah.
But yeah, like Canadians are just polite. Like the Geneva checklist is a Canadian invention, and
It is. I didn't know that.
yeah, well Canadian invention in the sense that it was because of like things like Canada. Oh my god! So this is really, really funny and sad story from World War One. At one point, like this is on, I believe it was the Western Front. So it was Canada and Germany basically on two opposite sides of the trenches, and the Canadians decided to throw over a whole bunch of cans of meat. And the Germans were like, wow, cool, thanks. Can you throw over some more? And the Canadians were like, sure. And they threw over grenades because it was the middle of the night, so you can't tell. So they started off with the meat and then they started throwing grenades. And then I was like,
that is like and I don't think any of our US listeners would know this, but like as a Canadian, I'm like, I totally believe that story, even if it didn't happen. And now I legitimately am gonna go fact check it later because it sounds like it would be 100% a thing. Canadians, and that could have gone the whole other way too. Canadians could have also just thrown like all of their food over. I would also believe that story.
So I actually, when I first read that, I actually pulled up the combat report. I don't have it saved anymore, but like if I can find it.
True?
Yeah, so it's true. I'll see if I can find it again, but like it would actually happen. And that's where, deceiving your enemies with food is now a violation of the Geneva Conventions or something like that.
It kind of should be.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah,
And,
it's
like,
horrible.
really
But
smart.
like, yeah. But also Canadian. This is also another fun one. Just fun fact about the Canadian military history. The UK and the US, like in World War One, their forces really like using shotguns in the trenches. The Canadians were very pro bayonets because it was quieter, so it was easier to do a trench raid with a bayonet as opposed to a shotgun. So yeah, fun fact about Canadians: like they're not nice people. They're just happen to be very polite. So yeah,
That's
and
so depressing, but also like, don't be fooled by the snowmen with spears memes, people.
yeah,
And Canadians, like you were saying earlier, like I don't think we've ever been so united on anything.
yeah.
Like Albertans and Quebecers agreeing on a thing, and now we might get an East pipeline.
Yeah, all of a sudden we're all on the same page about like, yeah, no, we shouldn't be depending on the United States. Fuck America.
Yeah, like and that's really scary too, right? For those diplomatic relations to fall, like we were talking about earlier with tourism in the US, right? Lots of people are gonna like lose their jobs, and up here, lots of people are gonna get laid off in the steel and aluminum industries in Ontario and Quebec. This all sucks. Okay. Yeah. Let's go back to icebreaker fleets.
Yeah, that was a fun little diversion with a little bit of Canadian military history. But before we get back to icebreaker fleets, I just want to mention this because everyone was afraid of trench raids except for the Canadian Army in the like First World War and Second World War. For some reason, Canadians love trench raids. I don't understand why, but yeah.
It sounds like because they were good at it.
Yeah, because they were amazing at trench raids, apparently. So
really depressing history.
Yeah, really depressing, but like as a military science and like military history kind of interest.
Well, I wonder though how much of that is like, yes, we have a small military and therefore we adapt to it.
Yeah. Well,
right? So
it's like what I mentioned with the Dictator's Handbook too, right? Like small militaries in well-democratized countries like Canada being a very prime example of this. The militaries tend to be well-equipped and well-trained, right? And I think that's exactly what happened was like Canada was a relatively new democracy, but it was very well democratized because it was a British colony for such a long time. And then World War I, World War II roll around and, you know, they had better equipment. About at the time it was about the same level of equipment, but they were so well trained and so disciplined and they were just so focused on like, no, we have to do this, right? So it's a very interesting mindset that you kind of get from a smaller military. But I digress. Back to defense and security spending. Part of Canada's goals here, 1.4 billion for maritime sensors. So this is for advanced underwater surveillance technology to detect submarines and other potential security threats. 5.5 billion for satellite ground stations. This is for real-time Arctic monitoring, communications, and intelligence gathering. I learned a little bit about like electronic warfare signals intelligence, just a couple of YouTube videos while I was working, and like really interesting stuff. New Arctic capable vehicles specialized in air, land.
Why don't we have that?
Yeah, like you'd think that this would be the first one you'd go for, right? Especially considering, again, we're an Arctic country and we're trying to say that like we're defending the Arctic. And I mentioned this earlier, but we have 4 diesel submarines that can't go into Arctic water. Like,
that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's such a joke because it's like, oh yeah, you know, we're so serious about this, but you have subs from like the 70s and 80s at this point that can't do anything. Like, and it was in the same CBC radio bit that I was listening to. They were talking about like, well, if you really want to do something, you need a nuclear submarine, or you need to try and like, you need like some kind of better propulsion system that can manage under water like that, or under like Arctic waters like that. And like, that's really expensive. And like, if Canada and the US still had a very positive relationship, we could probably call on our buddies to be like, hey, can we start buying nuclear subs from you guys? Unfortunately, though, that relationship's kind of gone down the toilet.
Yay, it's been like 3 weeks.
Yeah, 3 weeks, and all of a sudden now we can't buy nuclear subs.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So in addition to all that, there's expanding the icebreaker fleets. That's to counter the Russian dominance in icebreakers. And part of that actually I learned from the defense doc, or defense policy, was it was 2 heavy armed icebreakers was one of their goals, like actual military ships. And I was like, wow, I'm surprised we don't have that again. But
well, and the worst part about all of this is like, okay, so this is the plan right now. But going back to the fact that we're going into an election with 2 complete, like, regardless of whether the Liberals or the Conservatives win, sorry, NDP, you're not winning, get over it. He's still trying to convince people that he can win. It's driving me nuts. I digress. Regardless of which government gets in, like, all of this could completely change in April.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And like, it's a lot to process, especially going into an election like this too, right? Like, this is probably going to be Canada's most significant election ever. And I know, yeah, and I know like they say that about every election. It's like, oh, this is the most important election ever. It's like, no, this might actually be the most important election we've ever had.
The last election we had was basically won over the cost of orange juice.
Yeah.
Because of things like Harper's MP spending $20 on an orange juice. Yeah. And I'm not exaggerating that. Like, literally the last election was all about like government transparency and like the waste of the Conservatives did. Like, that's where we were 15 years ago.
Yeah. Like,
we've come such a long way as a society.
Yeah.
And I want the orange juice days back. I want the days where I'm just writing a blog about Harper trying to kick out the media from the House of Commons and expensive orange juice.
What simple times we used to live in, huh?
I published like 3 articles on like Harper being basically a fascist, and now I want to be like, okay, pass Nicole, calm down.
Yeah.
Shit, yeah.
Yeah. You ain't seen nothing yet. It gets worse.
You think the 4 years for 4 pot plants is bad?
Yeah.
Fuck, we're so screwed.
Yeah.
Oh, NATO's response. Do we even have NATO anymore? Like, what happens when your biggest NATO person, entity, whatever, just goes, fuck the lot of you?
What happens when 60% of NATO's budget goes out the window, basically? Because like the US contributes 900 billion to NATO, and the rest of NATO collectively contributes 600 billion. So like, it's so crazy how disproportionate it is. And NATO's response in the Arctic has been to try and assert themselves, basically, right? So Norway has been launching Arctic warfare drills, including 30,000 troops from NATO countries. In 2024, there was Steadfast Defender, which was the largest NATO military exercise in the Arctic since the Cold War. And that was to test rapid deployment defense strategies in extreme conditions.
That was after the Russians and Chinese started moving in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was Arctic Edge in Alaska, which was a joint US-Canada exercise, which was supposed to improve interoperability between allied forces, which I guess is just going down the fucking dumpster at this point. In addition to all that, Sweden and Finland have joined NATO recently, which is great because they have Arctic military forces and Arctic experience. And Finland has a notorious hatred for Russia, which I think is absolutely hilarious.
Really? Where'd that even come from?
Yeah, I wonder where it came from. You know, that whole like post-World War II invasion.
I actually don't know very much about Finland at all.
Oh, okay, so this is again me just being military history nerd. So post-World War II, when like the USSR was expanding, part of that was invading Finland, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and Finland didn't want that, so they fought back as far as they could, and that's where I don't remember what his name was, but there's one story that came out of that war, and it was a Finnish sniper who had like over 100 or something like over 100 confirmed kills, like without a scope, using like a rifle from the 1940s. And like this guy would basically just like hide in the tree line, like wait for a Russian to stick his head out, like, and then, pop him. And part of the reason why it took so long for him to get like caught or discovered was because he had lived in Finland his whole life. He knew the winter, so he knew what to do to stay hidden in the winter.
Hey, you know what that sounds like? It sounds like Canada should be listening to Indigenous people in the North.
Yeah, right? So you have that, where you have like that, there's that now culture of just like, nah, fuck those guys, in addition to just that knowledge and experience of operating in that space, which Sweden and Finland bring to the table in droves. Like, these are countries that have lived like super close to Russia in the Arctic forever.
And I think that it also demonstrates like how important it is to maintain your diplomatic ties. Like, yeah. I'm not shocked, but I'm also kind of shocked at the Democrats in the US for not being able to like recognize this as like oh shit, our Canadian diplomacy isn't gonna make it till the midterms.
Yeah.
Like this happened post World War II. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
And they're still pissed off about it.
Yeah. Like
so like,
well, because keep in mind that like Finland was under Russian control basically until the collapse of the USSR. So that's 50-ish years of oppression. Like, a lot of hatred can build up in 50 years, or in the case of Canada.
Make a Star Trek joke here about Cardassians.
Yeah. In the case of Canada, a lot of hatred can build up in 3 weeks. So,
well, we have a lot of like, we're nice, but we get angry very easily. And it turns out when you say you're going to invade our country and take away our healthcare,
yeah, we start throwing
sit well.
Yeah, we throw you cans of food, then we throw you grenades.
Honestly, if the US had healthcare, I think they'd have less of a problem here.
Well,
like to be totally frank, they have Disney World and New York.
So it's funny you mentioned that, because I actually saw an article on Reddit the other day. I didn't do like the full deep dive, and I definitely can't find it now. It's buried somewhere in there. But it was actually talking about how like, a lot of these issues just stem from the fact that the US doesn't have healthcare. The US doesn't have a strong education system. The US kind of lacks those basic like societal safety nets and supports that existed between the 40s and 50s.
Also,
that
their children get shot in schools.
exactly, right? Like you have all these things that, boomers got to benefit from like, 40s through, I don't know, just about 1980, when like neoliberalism kind of started taking a bigger stance in global politics. And like all of a sudden, all that stuff got stripped away. And all of a sudden, all these things started coming forward, right? All of a sudden, quote unquote, meaning like starting like the 90s, like to early to the mid 2000s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like a lot of it is just kind of rooted in the fact that there's so much like inequality and disparity between, your average American and Elon Musk, right?
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, that's a whole fucking thing we can talk about. But like that's where a lot of it seems to be rooted in, is just you don't have these supports, which leads to, anger and frustration and tension. And then like you don't know where that's, the human brain can't process it the same way that we can process like, oh, I cut my finger with a knife while I was cooking, right? That's a acute stress. But chronic stress is something so different on your brain that changes your mental, like your like neurochemistry so differently. And like, this is someone who did a minor in his undergrad about psychology talking about this. So like fucking don't quote me on that. But it's something to think about. And there is a lot of research on this, right?
Mm-hmm. This is very depressing, Rio.
I know, but the good news is that we're at our last segment, which isn't much better. So on the topic of poor mental health care, in 2019, Donald Trump publicly floated the idea of the US purchasing Greenland. And initially, the idea was widely dismissed. But as we now know, he has revealed his deeper, like long-term strategic and imperialist ambitions. And overall, Greenland, Canada, and the Arctic are prime targets for US influence and would strengthen America's position in the Arctic against Russia and China, right? And like, as you've already talked about, there's the resource component to this, there's a trade component of this, and like there's military and strategic components to all of this, right? Like it's, if you really look at it geopolitically, like for some reason Donald Trump went from being stupid to all of a sudden being really smart, kind of.
No, and see, here's the thing. The Bulwark was talking about this the other day. Trump doesn't give a flying fuck about any of this. The reason it's all happening is because the slightly less stupid people that wrote Project 2025 is where this is all coming from. Like, Trump probably couldn't even find the Arctic on the map. Like, the guy is not a genius at all. But I do wonder, too, what will happen if, God forbid, this actually gets to a point of no return.
Yep.
And say you, like, get a Democratic president in 2028. He takes office, he or she takes office in 2029. And suddenly you have all this tension. Let's, for argument's sake, say it's at, like, the worst it could be. And, like, the US has, like, occupied the Arctic.
Yep.
From a, like, what's best for the US perspective, a Democrat's not really going to backpedal on that if they, like, have a real chance of maintaining the Arctic.
Yep.
Like, and again, I don't want to fearmonger, but these are, like, things that you have to think about in a what's done is done kind of mentality, especially if Trump, like, completely destroys the relationship with Canada, which obviously he will do. Probably even if he doesn't actually put boots on the ground in the Arctic.
Yep.
The US will almost have, like, no choice but to stay there, right? Like, it's the same idea as what happened after Bush invaded Iraq. It's not like Obama, and, like, this is, like, a very heavy topic that, like, we don't have time to get into. And Obama definitely had problems, and, like, some of the shit that's coming out is akin to, like, Bush level crap. And he definitely liked to kill people with drones. But, like, why was he put in the position in the first place? It's not like he could be like, I'm taking power today. And, oh yeah, the whole Iraq thing,
Forget about it.
Forget it's fine. Like,
Yeah.
come home, everything's fine. Like, the Middle East is a fucking dumpster fire now. And like, it's always been a dumpster fire. But like, the dumpster fire we currently have is because of what happened with Bush and his like, oh, I can use this as an excuse to go and find mass weapons of destruction that don't exist. And then literally go, oops.
Yeah.
Our
Sorry, it
bad.
turns out they didn't have it.
Also, we
but-
kind of assassinated that guy. But he was a
Yeah.
bad guy anyway, which he like totally was, and nobody was sad about that. Same with like Osama bin Laden, right? Like, I'm pretty sure the whole Western world was like, yeah, fuck that guy, good job.
Yeah.
But like, it just kind of demonstrates that once a country is like in it,
Yep.
you're in it.
Yeah, you really can't get out. And actually, this is another really interesting thing I saw on CBC the other day is like Russia's economy like running crazy hot, and it's almost overheating because of the war in Ukraine, right? And like that was supposed to be a 3-day operation that's now in its 3rd year. So, but what are you supposed to do? Because you know
Yeah.
you can't just be like, sorry about that invasion we started 3 years ago for like really no good reason. What do you say? Like, what do you say we just kind of go back to normal? Even if you just went back to your old borders, you're never going to get rid of the fact that like you now have a population that lives on your southern border that hates you even more than they did before, that is now actively considering developing nuclear weapons because of your invasion, right?
Well, and we can see similar things in like Ukraine. So, my husband's stepdad has Ukrainian cousins that he brought over when just after Russia invaded the Ukraine. And we were talking to them at like Christmas time, and she was talking about, one of them was talking about her mom and how like, I think it was her mom that she was telling me about. Anyway, she was telling me about how like they're now, even Ukrainians that have grown up in Russian speaking areas no longer speak Russian because they see it as a betrayal, right? Like, these people are invading us, stop fucking speaking in their language. I actually saw this, where was that? It was recently, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, right? He's a president. Yeah. He was being interviewed by a US talk show host or somebody in the US who spoke Russian, and he was trying to like engage with Zelensky in Russian, and Zelensky was like, I'm not fucking speaking in Russian.
Yeah.
Like, stop it. And he like, obviously he wasn't that like, because he's elegant, but basically the bottom line was, don't speak to me in Russian. They're awful. We hate them.
Yeah.
I'm not ever speaking another Russian word again. And so it was like really interesting because the interviewer was also like not letting up.
Yeah.
Like, he was still talking in Russian, and Zelensky was like, I don't understand why you're still talking to me in Russian.
Yeah.
Like, stop it. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you like, even just bringing that a little bit closer to home now, like people see buying Florida oranges as like taboo in Canada now. That took 3 weeks. And like, we went like, so my girlfriend and I went to Costco like, 2 weeks ago now. And like, I was actually frustrated that I couldn't find non-American oranges, but like I wanted oranges. So I was like, okay, so I can go here and pay like, $11 in the box that I'm going to pay, $17 for at Safeway. And I was just one of those moments where like, God fucking damn it.
Eat a different fruit, Rio.
I know. And then I had the same issue with Spam because literally like we were like, there's no Canadian equivalent to Spam. That's an American invention.
Oh, you eat Spam?
Filipino thing, man.
I know, but like, I didn't think it was an actual thing. Oh, that's so gross.
I mean, you gotta like.
You need food? I'll give you food. Please eat better.
It's a weekend treat. So.
Spam is not a treat, Rio.
It is for
poor,
us.
poor man.
Anyway, all that is to say is like,
Oh my god.
Yeah. Anyway, all that is to say, back on topic, is like the betrayal, like the damage you can do to like, your international relationships just by like, starting a trade war, invading your
I
like,
still buy
neighbors.
French's ketchup after the last trade war.
Yeah, and like, you know, I've started buying French's ketchup. I switched everything to Canadian. At least like picked up a bottle of like American maple
Isn't, like,
syrup.
French's ketchup like really weird at first.
Yeah, it has a weird
Right?
taste, right?
It gets better.
Yeah,
Now
but
I taste Heinz and I'm like, this stuff's gross.
yeah, but I also like, I was joking with my girlfriend, like, because she picked up a bottle of American maple syrup. And then I was
What?
like, yeah, and I was like, we can't buy that. It's not Canadian. And then like, so like,
Did you see the 22 minutes skit?
yeah, I did.
Americans are talking about Jon Stewart like showed that sketch, or was it Seth Meyers? One of the two like showed that sketch.
Yeah, I saw it and I was like, and that's why I'm checking everything, right? Because I'm like, no, you can't buy American maple syrup. And I was like,
I mean, you can't buy American maple syrup anyway.
Um,
Your Quebec is like right here.
fun fact, you can. I think it's, oh,
You
well,
shouldn't. That is
I
an
know.
atrocity.
You shouldn't, but you can.
That's
So
disgusting.
like,
Don't
I
buy it.
know. So, but also, I have another funny story I'll tell you when we're offline about me shaming her cousin for buying American maple syrup. So, but that's,
Which you don't do now.
yeah, don't do it now, but you know, things to consider. And on the topic, back on the topic of like strategic relations, you know, how would you ever repair that, right? Like, even if it was a Democratic president with the Democratic House and Democratic Senate, like, if you're already at that point where like your boots on the ground, you can't just pull out. And like, even if actually, this is really interesting because I've seen it floated that like, even if Russia was totally successful in Ukraine, you'd basically be facing a permanent insurgency because the people are going to hate you for the rest of your life. And like, well, for the rest of forever, basically. And like, you know,
I mean,
I
how long
wouldn't,
does Putin have? That guy's old, right?
he's like almost, I want to say like, he's almost 80, I think. Like,
Yeah, he's got to be like Trump's age, right?
yeah.
Although
And
he's much healthier than Trump. Trump's gonna die of a heart attack after eating McDonald's.
yeah,
Putin still like apparently works out and stuff. I
Yeah.
think that's a side of being like a former KGB operative and also wanting, you know, half the world wants to kill you.
yeah. You probably have to be a little bit healthy for that, right? But yeah, and the same thing with Canada, right? Like I mentioned, we'll throw you cans of food, and then the Canadian Army will throw grenades at you after you're comfortable getting food from us.
Don't
So,
tell
like,
them our tricks, Rio.
dude,
We need to distract them with our snowman army first.
it's been 100 years. Anyway, but right, but yeah, like that's what you're facing if that ever happens. Like, you'd probably actually have a Canadian insurgency, which I dread to see what that would be like because Canadians are very, yeah, Canadians are very stabby as well. Fun fact. Like,
Yeah, we don't like guns. We like knives.
yeah, it's
And
more personal that
broken
way.
glass bottles. It was interesting. I remember sitting in like a criminology class in university, and the professor took out like crime stats, and it was like an overlay of violent crime in America per capita and violent crime in Canada per capita, and then overlaid on that was like the death rate.
Yeah.
And he was like, see, we don't actually have less violent crime. We just like to stab people, so people die less from that.
Yeah.
Whereas like Americans shoot each other, and that's like more deadly.
Yeah.
So it was just kind of interesting, like seeing that, and I was like, shit, we do get stabby.
Yeah. Canadians like it to be more personal, you know? Like shooting a gun is very like, oh, you're all the way over there. But when it's a knife, you have to be in their space. So it's a lot more personal. So yeah.
We are
Interest-
terrifying.
Yeah. We have a very interesting culture. If you really start to like peel apart the layers of what it means to be Canadian, it's very interesting. And apparently that,
Tim Hortons,
yeah,
which
Tim
is
Hortons,
disgusting, and don't ever drink it.
yeah, Tim Hortons is bad coffee. Go to Second Cup. Not
Second
sponsored.
Cup does have some good coffee though, and their hot chocolate's really good too.
Yeah, we're not sponsored by Second Cup yet.
But if you are a Second Cup looking to get sponsored,
Yeah, let us know.
or not, since we're doing it for free.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think that's a good part to
Yeah.
kind of like end off the thoughts on like strategic considerations, because you know, and we've already talked about Russia and China so much that like really at this point, I think a lot of it just kind of boils down to how America's,
Russia and China.
yeah, well, a lot of it's like, how is America going to handle its relationship with its allies, especially allies, quote unquote, especially when those relationships are just fundamentally changed.
I
And
mean,
like,
they're not.
yeah, they're not.
Even when they try, like Marco Rubio tried to walk back the whole Gaza thing. He was like, no, that's not what he meant. He just meant this. And then literally the next day, Trump was like, no, I meant beachfront property. Like,
He just doubled down.
Rubio was like, oh my God.
That must be the most stressful place to work. Like, the White House is
They all
probably
did it
stressful
for
in general, but
themselves.
like, yeah.
They have no sympathy for me. You're stuck with Elon Musk and Trump. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Even today, Americans were arguing about how, like, because Musk in that clip that I sent you stood up and was like, this is what America voted for. And the guy in the clip was like, this isn't what America voted for. And I was like, no, it is. Trump, in one way or another, literally told everybody what he was going to do. Even the Gaza thing, he was talking about that in 2018.
Yeah.
Jared Kushner went on TV and literally said it would be prime real estate.
Yep.
Why do I know this as a Canadian and you don't?
Yeah. I like, it's kind of sad that like that's the state we're also into, or like where like Canadians are so informed about American politics, and then it's dumb.
They don't understand why. They have no idea.
Yeah, and then a lot of them don't even understand Canadian politics. And kind of going back to my girlfriend's cousin that I shamed for American maple syrup, like when we visited Australia, we were talking to him, and he was like, honestly, most people don't even know the prime minister's name. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah, most people don't know their MP. They don't know their prime minister, like, because politics in Australia is just that different, right?
Well, and I think that part of the difference is, A, the US has a lot of influence.
Yeah.
And like, I'm just as guilty. Like, if I have to watch a Polyev speech, or I can watch a bunch of mega people crying because Trump deported one of their family members that they didn't think would be susceptible to Trump's immigration policies because they weren't a criminal, even though Trump considers them a criminal because they are in the States illegally.
Yeah.
Makes me laugh. And like, it's like a train wreck you can't look away from.
Yeah.
Our train wreck is Justin Trudeau going, you know what, guys, kind of suck and everybody hates me. So I'm just going to step down and you guys run your thing.
Yeah, I'm going to step down. You guys figure it out.
Yeah, and that was like a huge thing. It was so big that even like the Bulwark brought on like Canadian podcasters to like talk about the scandal.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, like you look at the US and you're like, you guys are just on fire, and I can't look away from it.
Yeah.
But it's also just so influential in like what happens here. Like Trump's tariffs, because we're so much smaller, could decimate our economy. Like the other thing he's right about is it's not that because people keep saying to him like, well, are you going to send troops into Canada? And he's like, no, I'm just going to decimate them economically. Why? Because he doesn't have to send troops into Canada. Like 50% tariffs will destroy the auto industry.
Yep.
I mean, unfortunately, he doesn't realize it's going to destroy the auto industry on his side of the border too, because the supply chains in the auto industry is like, we could do a whole podcast just on like how North America has like built the auto industry to function how it's currently functioning. So when it dies on our side, it dies on their side. Kentucky's having a like complete tantrum right now because all across Canada, people stopped ordering their bourbon. Yeah, their bourbon. And it's being pulled off liquor store shelves. Like the governor went on like Canadian TV and was like, could you guys please buy our bourbon? And we were like, no, red state who voted for Trump.
Crown Royal.
Right?
Yeah.
Like if it sounds French, it's probably Canadian. But like that's really significant. And it is going to disproportionately affect red states. Because of how that's all designed. Whereas blue states can like weather that a bit more. It's fascinating, but also like super scary what could happen because again, like I said, Trump's not wrong. Like he can just decimate us economically and then what do we do? I mean, we'll just die because we won't join the US. And I think that's where his whole like thing falls apart. We'll just have like 60% unemployment, I guess.
Cool.
Fun times ahead. We're stubborn too.
Yeah, Canadians are vehemently against becoming Americans. Like,
Yeah, it's almost like we pride ourselves on not being American. Like Canadians get like I don't care. I'm just like, oh, I'm Canadian. But like I've seen traveling, like Canadians get really, really angry. Well, not like angry, but like if somebody was like, oh, you're from America, Canadians are like, no, no, no. See the maple leaf pin? I'm Canadian.
Yeah.
Oh, same difference. And then you're like, oh
no.
no.
I have been that tourist. So like
I mean, Americans travel with Canadian. Like, I remember when we went to Mexico, there was like an American couple, and he had like the swim trunks, but they were like the Canadian flag, basically.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, fellow Canadians. And they were like, not really, but don't tell anyone. And I was like, you guys sound like you're from Alabama. Like, you're not hiding this very well. But even Americans pretend to be Canadians when they travel.
And like, I know we fact checked this, so we know it's not true, but like, I stand by the Thanksgiving is really just Canadian Thanksgiving is for Canadians to give thanks that we're not Americans. I know
It's not true.
I know it's not true. I think we should make it true.
I was joking with my therapist about that, and he said that he likes your theory more, but I think you're both dumb.
I think we should make it true.
God,
Have a
right
national
now is
holiday.
probably the perfect time to make that true. Like, I bet if in October people started sending it around, celebrate that we're not American. If this shit's going on, you might be able to make that fly.
Oh, I'm starting that this October. Thank you for the idea.
I think that's like a great place to end on.
Yeah.
Thanksgiving is the celebrating not being American.
Yeah.
I will clarify though, like, we joke, but we do. I have lots of friends in the US, and it's actually really scary for me to think like what's going on down there. And I like see their Facebook pages. I have one friend who actually lived through like the civil rights movement. She's an older lady who I think is like legitimately terrified at what's happening to their country. So like, we know that not all Americans are to blame for this. We know that like, 50% of the population doesn't support Trump.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, Canadians have to be this way because your president is Trump.
Yeah.
So no, we still love you if you didn't vote for Trump. But we can't buy your crap right now.
Yeah. Like, I have a lot of family.
Or go to Orlando and see Harry Potter World.
Yeah. I have a lot of family in the States, and like, I was telling you this before we got on, but like, we're not going to San Francisco anymore to visit my aunt, specifically because of the trade war. So like, I actually was thinking of just messaging her and being like, hey, so like trade war, and also the euro dollar is a lot better than ours. Why don't you just come back here? But yeah, but actually I'll send her a message after this. Yeah.
But like, yeah, I mean, we were going to go to Orlando, and Rob wanted to go to Portland and San Francisco. Our travel budget, like, we saved up a lot for this year, like over a 5-year period. Our travel budget alone for this year was $12,000.
Yeah.
That shit is now going to Japan. Rob's going to see Tokyo and Kyoto, and I'm taking my ass to Universal Studios Japan. So I don't need no Orlando, Florida for Harry Potter World, because fun fact, apparently they have that, and a Sailor Moon ride. Yeah. So pop that, Orlando.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'm going to go they even have Tokyo Disney. I literally need America for nothing. So we're going to spend our $12K, unless my dog costs a lot of money, but like, that's a whole other thing. We're going to spend our $12K that would have gone to the US in Japan.
Yeah.
Who also has a weaker yen than our dollar, although that's...
How much longer? Who knows?
We don't know. I bought Japanese cash in like, I bought $2,000 in yen in like January, because I was like, this is not going anywhere good. Yeah. And I'm gonna buy a lot of Pokemon plushies. But yeah, so we're taking $12,000 just from our house that would have gone to America, that's now going to Japan. Yeah. And I know we're not the only Canadians that have done that. Like, you're leaving on Friday to go somewhere, and you were gonna go to the States. But
East Asia.
So exactly 100% of us in this conversation have canceled American travel plans this year at
Yep.
significant cost, and that's just two of us. Yeah, we don't need to be told to like fight. And I think we were talking about this before too, right? Like our MP went on a American podcast and they said like, what would you tell Canadians to do? And he said, I don't need to tell Canadians to do anything. They're not buying American products because they're all on the bottom shelf at the grocery store, and they're all canceling their travel plans to the US, which we're seeing through statements from the Tourism Association in America. So we love you, but we're building a wall and not coming there for 4 years.
Yeah. Anyway, all that is to say, and the bottom line of today's podcast is the future of the Arctic is uncertain. And Canada, as the true North, strong and free, will continue to try to be the true North, strong and free. And yeah, unfortunately, just with the way things currently are, you know, Canadian-US relations are kind of in the toilet. But hey, you know, we don't really need you because we'll buy Crown Royal, Canadian maple syrup, and craft dinner. That's all we really need.
Universal Japan.
Yeah, go to Universal Japan, and I'm going to the UK maybe this summer. So take that, America.
On that note, guys, we will see you in a couple weeks.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And remember, if it sounds like bullshit, it probably is.
You made it this far, you're clearly fired up. So don't let the algorithm bury this. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next rant. And if you really want to shake things up, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep the pressure on, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.